everybody today who wasn't here last week. Dr. Chuck Green has been teaching at Hope for several decades. He's a professor of psychology and teaches classes on social psychology and race in America. For a number of years, he directed the Phelps Scholars Program, which is an academic residential opportunity for first-year students who are interested in the ideas of race and culture. So last week we talked about how did we get here. Today we're going to find out what's going on now. So welcome everybody, and Dr. Green.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Ann. I appreciate it. And thanks to everybody who came back today to give me a second chance. Second chances are good in life, and I'm grateful for that. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. Well, like last week, I've got some formal prepared remarks that won't begin to take all of our time. So there'll be a lot of time for questions. You all had a lot of good questions last week, but I brought some questions too that we could discuss if you want to do that, but we'll see what you all want to do. Okay, share the screen, share the slides. I really do mean share. Here we go. Okay, so as Ann said I've got 4 questions that I can just offer some preliminary responses to in our 3 class sessions together. And last week we talked about how did we end up here. Now, a lot of people think that everybody remembers every word they've ever said. But I've been giving exams since 1980, and it's very clear to me that nobody remembers every word I've ever said. So, just a quick review from last week. The most important couple of things include this: the idea that the concept of race emerged out of European colonialism, right? There's always been ethnocentrism. There's always been conflict based on differences of culture and differences in power and that sort of thing. But race, as we understand it, was not on the map until the Europeans developed that concept as a way of rationalizing a pretty brutal exploitation of people on every other continent. And so this idea that there's a finite number of races that operate a little bit like we think about subspecies in the animal world, and that race is a determinant of sort of who you essentially are and what you essentially are able to do. That's a new thing, new in the sense that it's been around for 400 or 500 years. The other thing that I'm not going to reflect on specifically today that I'll mention is the idea put forth by a historian by the name of Ibram X. Kendi, who wrote a book called Stamped from the Beginning: The History of Racist Ideas in the U.S. He takes on this notion we have that things started off, well, the notion that white Americans have at least, that things started off really bad and that slowly we've been getting better ever since. And his point is that that things did start off bad. He's not quarreling with that, but that we haven't had 400 years of slow, steady progress, that we've had mostly the status quo, punctuated by bursts of progress, followed by a backlash to that progress that sort of recalibrates the position of people from different racial groups. And so his classic example of that is that the Civil War and the dozen or so years that followed was this big burst of progress. But Jim Crow, which had its Southern manifestations, but frankly, its Northern manifestations too. Jim Crow was an attempt, a very successful attempt, a violent attempt to put the racial hierarchy back in place. the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s was another such burst of progress. But Kendi argues that the last 50, 60 years, we have not been living in a post-civil rights era. We're actually living in the era of the backlash to civil rights. And that from that lens, from that framework, a lot of the truly overt racism that we've specifically seen in the last few years is the culmination of that backlash to the civil rights movement. Okay, I think everything else I'm gonna that we need to know, I'm gonna touch on here. So I'd like to begin again with a land acknowledgement. I know that many of you may remember this from last week, but I think it's important to do it more than once. It's important, maybe not for you, but it's important for me to do this more than once. It's important for me to remember something about the land where we all are today. We respectfully acknowledge that we meet today on the traditional land of the Odawa, the Potawatomi, and other Anishinaabe people who were forced to relocate when a contingent of Dutch settlers moved into this area in the mid-19th century. We recognize too the continuing presence of the Anishinaabe on this land and their unique and enduring relationship with their traditional territories. Thanks. Okay, so what exactly is going on? And I don't necessarily mean today or even the last month, but over the last decade in particular, and then we'll kind of lead up to the current moment. Two more definitions from Emerson and Smith that are really important to remember, because pretty much everything that I'm going to talk about today hinges on these definitions. Paired definitions in the sense that they feed into each other. The first is racialization, this idea that race matters profoundly for differences in life experience, life opportunities, and social relationships. And then coming out of that, a definition of racism that I think may be new for a number of people. It was certainly not something that I understood even 20 years ago. But this idea that racism is a changing ideology with the constant and rational purpose of perpetuating and justifying a social system that is racialized. And there's some really important words in there. This idea that racism is by changing, I really think that what Emerson and Smith mean is that it's a flexible ideology. It can move here, it can move there, it can morph in different ways, but it has a constant purpose, and that is justifying racialization, justifying the fact that we live in a racialized society, justifying the fact that most of the power and resources in this country disproportionately go to people who are white, or who we call white, based on the way we define race. I think another important word in there is rational, right? So often we think of racism as irrational, or at least we think of bigotry as irrational, right? 40 years ago, when I first started studying this in grad school, I was really interested in knowing, why are some people bigots, right? Which is, I believed, irrational, right? It was a defect. What was it about the way they thought? Was it about their early life experience? What was it about them? What defect did bigots have that left them bigoted, right? What was the problem with the bigots? And Emerson and Smith argue that there's nothing irrational for white people to support racialization if you're looking at it from an economic standpoint, right? White people benefit from racialization. And so racism, which is the justification of racialization, is a pretty rational thing to do. If you're benefiting from the status quo, then what you want to do is defend that. And what you want to do is support that. Okay. There we go. My cursor keeps wandering off. Okay. So what we're going to do today is break down contemporary racialization and then contemporary racism, put that into a bit of context, and then we'll have a chance to talk, I hope, specifically talk about things that have just happened in the last couple of months. So contemporary racialization is the unjust allocation of resources. And the first thing I want to talk about is income. Okay, here's where I'm going to pick up with the more formal text. You won't be surprised to know that Black and Latino families make only about 60% of the income of white families on average. That really adds up over the years. For people born in the early 1950s, right about retirement age now, the racial ethnic differences in their lifetime earnings are quite large, especially for men. White men made nearly $1 million more across their career than Black and Latino men. If you're Black or Latino, imagine making $1 million more. And if you're white, imagine making $1 million less. Why the disparity? History is part of the disparity. We saw that last week. But Deva Pager and many other social scientists have shown time and again that a resume with a white-sounding name still elicits far more requests for an interview than an identical resume with a Black or Latino-sounding name. You can see here from one of Pager's early studies, published in 2003, that white applications with a criminal record had slightly more callbacks than Black applications with no criminal record, right? Everything else about these applications was identical. Pager invented these people and invented the resumes, sent them out to real companies that were advertising real openings, and found that being Black has the same effect on a stellar job application as serving time for a felony. If you want to quantify the discrimination that well-qualified Black Americans face in all kinds of industries in this country, think of it like this: it's a little stronger stigma than just coming out of prison for a serious felony. A plurality of white people in this country believe that whites face more discrimination on the job market today than do people of color, but I have seen zero research support for that idea. Now let's look at wealth. Your assets minus your debts. Wealth is even more important than income and more indicative of family financial history because, as my life story showed that I talked about last week, much of our wealth is passed from one generation to another. The Census Bureau reported last fall that wealth inequality, the gap between the richest and the poorest, wealth inequality is higher now than at any point since they started tracking it in 1967. And there's a huge race gap. Studies consistently show that Black and Latino families have 5 to 10% of the wealth of white families. I'm not saying it's 5 to 10% less. I'm saying it's 5 to 10% as much, and the gap is growing. See how Black and Latino wealth is up since 1963, only slightly. These are 2016 dollars, so the amounts are held consistent across the years. But white wealth has gone up quite a bit. This is way more than money. This is a chance to buy a house. This is a chance to go to college. This is a chance to retire comfortably. Furthermore, the poverty, get this, this is underknown and underappreciated. The poverty of one's community is as important or more important in determining life opportunities as the poverty of one's family. The Annie E. Casey Foundation reported last year that nearly half of Native Black and Latino children live in high poverty, low opportunity neighborhoods. Even if they're not officially in poverty themselves, they grow up with very few resources or social connections for getting ahead. A little bit about health. There's a large disparity by race and ethnicity in health and healthcare. We've seen so much of that in the last few months with the pandemic, right? Courtney Cogburn is a member of the social work faculty at Columbia. And she says this: Our lived experiences contribute to racial inequalities in health. For the 15 leading causes of death, Blacks have an earlier onset, a faster progression, and earlier death than whites, even when we account for education, income, and health insurance. Right? I've read so many news reports over the last few months about how COVID-19 has uncovered racial disparities in health. But people have been talking about racial disparities in health, and the research has been showing that for a very long time. And it's important to note that even when you control for education, income, and health insurance, they still exist. Okay, so here's a map of Chicago, right? Chicagoans who live in the Streeterville neighborhood, up by the Magnificent Mile and Navy Pier, they have a life expectancy of 90 years. Chicagoans who live 9 miles south in Englewood have a life expectancy of 60 years, right? A 30-year gap. Economic differences are an important factor, of course, but so is the accumulated stress of racial discrimination, which takes a significant toll on the body. When you see me doing this, I'm admitting some more people here. Infant health and maternal health are especially poor for African Americans. The uterus is a blood-rich organ, and stress damages the uterus in much the same way it damages the heart. The result is a significant increase in very low birth weight babies and in mothers who die at childbirth at every level of income and education. Okay, let's talk about segregation, residential segregation in particular. Social psychologist Thomas Pettigrew has written that residential segregation is what he called the linchpin of racialization because it makes all of the other forms possible. This is Douglas Massey. He's a sociologist, best known as the co-author of a book called American Apartheid. And he says that segregation is as high now, in an article published just a couple of years ago, it's as high now as it has ever been, and higher in many places, especially in the Northeast and the Upper Midwest, the two most segregated parts of the country. In the 2010 census, it'll be interesting to see what the 2020 census says. In the 2010 census, the Census Bureau identified the 10 most segregated urban areas in the United States, and 5 of them were in the state of Michigan. The one change over the last 50 years is that today most white people are willing to live in a neighborhood with Black or Latino people if there are only 1, maybe 2 families of color, and those families are professional and middle class. Right? The line has moved from all white to virtually all white if there are only a few of them and they meet or exceed average community levels of income and education. And because these white people are open to living near a very small number of the right kind of people of color, they genuinely believe themselves to be non-racist. It's the same thing in schools. Most white people tell pollsters that they favor integrated schools, but almost all of them select segregated options for their own children. Sociologist Ann Owens says this: once you control for all the other things parents might say they care about, economic class, test scores, resources, etc., and think about the bigotry embedded in those preferences as well, white parents still prefer schools serving fewer Black or Hispanic kids. The woman in the middle here is Nikole Hannah-Jones. She is a journalist with the New York Times and has written and studied extensively about school segregation. Now, I'm told that my video clip last week didn't come across very well. So I'm going to summarize this a little bit in case you're not catching all of the words. Clearly, Ms. Hannah-Jones is on a panel of some sort They're in New York City. The topic is school segregation. And we're going to begin with a question from a white audience member, a parent of children in the New York City schools. And she is explaining that sometimes parents like herself select a school that is more white rather than more integrated because there are other things that drive them to that school, and it's not really about race. And then we'll hear Nicole Hannah-Jones's response to that.
I also live in Brooklyn, and I wonder if you know about PS 282. It's at the corner of 6th Avenue in Lincoln, and it's the zone right over from 321, and we're zoned for it, and I always said I would go there. My kids did not end up going there. They went to Brooklyn New School, which is like 261 in its kind of curation.
So what happened?
Well, I kept going and touring it, and there was, well, first of all, they had uniforms, which doesn't appeal. So I guess what I wanted to say was, in addition, there are people who choose the schools, and there's another alibi or another sort of reason. It's not just test scores. It's I want arts for my school, my children. I want arts. I don't want it to be strict and disciplined and drilling. And I don't care about the test scores as much. I want there to be interdisciplinary education or something like that. So I just wanted to sort of.
Or you don't want them to have uniforms.
Or I don't want them to have uniform. But I mean, it was all kind of a package.
Right, but I think. Sorry. No, go ahead.
No, I want to hear what you have to say, because I'm basically.
This is the amazing thing about segregation and racial privilege. It is extremely adaptable. Yeah. So what you find is in segregated cities where there's a great deal of residential segregation, white parents will say, we want neighborhood schools because the neighborhood schools are going to be white. In a city like New York, where you have areas that are gentrifying or schools that may be black schools in white neighborhoods, suddenly we want district-wide choice. I want to be able to send my child anywhere in the district, and I will put my child on a train for an hour to get a good school.
Right.
Or we'll say, we don't want uniforms, or we really do want uniforms, depending on what the neighborhood school is. Or I really want arts, or I really want whatever the program is.
That was basically my point.
Right,
to
what
say
you find, and you find this all over the country, is in every community, based on community by community basis, whatever is going to preserve your access to predominantly white schools is what I'm not saying this to be funny. I'm saying this because this is actually what you can look at the data. I've written about public schools all across this country, and I can tell you, depending on the community, the values of that community are whatever going to preserve the types of schools that the parents with power want to send their kids to. And we all can do it in very race neutral language, which is how we do it. Neighborhood schools is race neutral. Choice, which has never benefited poor Black and Latino parents, is race neutral. But the thing that is the most telling is you look in any community, no matter how they order their schools, and the inequalities are exactly the same.
Okay, in 1974, white suburban Detroit families sued to prevent school desegregation from crossing school district lines. They also firebombed a school bus parking lot as part of their protest. And the Supreme Court ruled in their favor. The message of the court was clear. Move to a white area and keep it white. If you can maintain residential segregation, you get to have school segregation too. The White Citizens Council of Dallas County, Alabama circulated this flyer in 1963. What have I done personally to maintain segregation? It's a good question for all of us who are white, frankly. When we look for nice neighborhoods and good schools and a church where we can feel comfortable, what is it we're really looking for? Let's bring this closer to home. White people around here often talk about living in the West Michigan bubble. But West Michigan is very diverse. It's simply extremely segregated. We talk about living in a bubble, but because we want to pretend that our segregated lives are some sort of inevitability or some sort of accident. There is no West Michigan bubble. White people in West Michigan have self-embubbulated, right? But we don't want to admit that to ourselves. So we pretend that we're trapped by these circumstances. All this racialization is what theologian James Cone had in mind when he wrote this in Black Theology and Black Power back in 1969. I am not prepared to talk seriously with a man who essentially says, I sit on a man's back, choking him and making him carry me, and yet assure myself and others that I feel very sorry for him, and I wish to lighten his load by all possible means, except by getting off his back. Okay, that's a glimpse into our contemporary racialization. Now, what about the racism that justifies it and maintains it? There are three kinds of racism that operate today that I want to draw to your attention. The first is overt and out there racism, which we've experienced throughout our history, but which has become more visible to many of us over the last decade or so. We see it every day. There are Border Patrol agents with a racist Facebook page. There are people who dial 911 because a Black family is using a grill in a public park. There are people who decide that right now would be a great time to walk over to a table of Black people at the restaurant and call them the N-word. There are people who go ballistic because someone is speaking a language other than English. There are people who physically attack women because they are wearing a hijab. There's a city council candidate in Marysville, Michigan, who ran last fall in order to keep Marysville as white as possible. And the list goes on. So why would this be? Why this overt out there racism? What I'm about to tell you is harsh, and it's cruel, it's nasty, and you need to know it. Political scientists Ashley Jardina and Spencer Piston recently asked a nationally representative sample of white American adults to look at this figure, often called the ascent of man. They asked participants, you see the numbers there, 0, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. They asked participants to indicate where white people fall on this continuum and where Black people fall on this continuum. 38% of white respondents indicated that Black people are less evolved. Did you hear that? Less evolved than white people. Some by a little, some by a lot. Think about that. You're a Black person in this country, and on average, 1/3 of the white people you encounter believe that you are not fully human, that you are essentially animalistic in some fundamental way. This was true for white people in all economic classes, by the way. So all of us, overeducated, upper middle class white people here today, need to stop thinking of racism as a problem primarily of the white working class. We're just using our classism to mask our racism. And this was true of people in both political parties. Just because you didn't vote for the racist in chief doesn't mean you're off the hook. There was one big political difference, however. Right? Percent of white people who believe Black people are less evolved than whites. 28% of the people who voted against Donald Trump in 2016 believe that Black people are less evolved than white. These are the people who voted against Donald Trump. And of the people who voted for Donald Trump, it was 52%, just over half, right? Trump supporters' written comments were much more likely to be vicious as well, describing Black people with these terms: savages, barbarians, animals. It isn't a surprise that the 275 cities that hosted a Trump campaign rally in 2016, of the cities he visited, they saw a 226% increase in reported hate crimes compared with the list of comparable cities Trump did not visit. Now remember, as we just saw, there are racists in every political corner. Whatever party you're in, you got racists in your party with you, and you need to be responding to them. But the sad truth of the matter is the Republican Party has more of them, and more of them who openly embrace white supremacy. The Democrats used to be the party of white supremacy, but that started changing in about 1948, when Hubert Humphrey convinced the convention to support civil rights for the first time. In 1964, when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, many Republicans decided that they could begin to win elections by appealing to white supremacy. And they did. Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush, all in one way or another campaigned and governed using not so subtle appeals to white supremacy. Donald Trump is not the exception. Among Republican presidents over the last 50 years, Donald Trump is the logical conclusion. The GOP of 2020 is exactly where the Republican Party has been headed since 1964, which, according to Ian Haney Lopez, a professor of law at UC Berkeley, was the very last presidential election in which a Democrat received a majority of the white vote. Donald Trump did better than the average Republican candidate with white voters, by the way. He won 58%. I do not say this to encourage anyone to leave the Republican Party. This country needs a conservative party. My apologies. This country needs a conservative party with truly conservative principles, not an authoritarian xenophobic party that masquerades as conservative. If you are a Republican, please stay right where you are and work from the inside for change. Do us all a favor. Make the Republican Party great again. One more sad truth about overt out there racism: it's not just us old folk. White millennials are just about as racist as their parents. Note that I say white millennials, right? There's a lot more racial ethnic diversity in younger generations than in older generations. And so if you're seeing a straight up comparison between, for example, the baby boomers and the millennials, you're going to see millennials being less racist. But if you're just looking at the white members of those two cohorts, you don't see a very big difference. Young people today, some young people today, are being nurtured in an environment that actively encourages them to embrace racism, right? Think Charlottesville. White supremacists are online recruiting young white men in particular with a zeal that would shame ISIS. I've seen it. Okay, second kind of contemporary racism, right? The overt and out there kind, which is what we usually think about. Now let's talk about widespread beliefs and assumptions about race in the world and generally among people who generally view themselves as not being racist, right? We have all inhaled the smog of racism, and if we haven't yet worked through that, we're going to be infected by it. Here are a few examples. Eduardo Bonilla Silva, a sociologist at Duke and author of the book, Racism Without Racists, identified several common assumptions about race shared by many white people of all ages. Number one, cultural racism. People and groups of people pretty much end up where they belong. Social structures and personal resources don't matter. If you're poor or poorly treated, odds are you're deficient in some way, and you brought that on yourself. Let me elaborate on that in just a bit. The things that white people say today about Black people are very similar to the things that white people said 150 years ago about Black people. But the wording is a little bit different, right? 100 years ago even, race differences were considered widely among white people to be a result of genetic differences. World War II made that a difficult thing to talk about. So now you hear the same kind of assertions from white people about Black people, but they talk about it in terms of culture, right? They talk about it not in terms of genetics, which we did 100 years ago, but in terms of culture. But the adjectives that are used are still very similar. Second assumption, naturalism. The way things are is just the way they're supposed to be, right? They're natural. It makes sense for white people to be in charge. It makes sense for neighborhoods to be segregated. Makes sense for children of color to attend under-resourced schools. It's just natural. It's just the way things are. And third, minimization, right? Besides, the assumption goes, things aren't nearly as bad as people of color and bleeding heart white liberals make them out to be. A little adversity is actually good for you. And if you just stop playing the victim and do something with your life, it wouldn't be a problem. So these assumptions about race and racism are similar to the assumptions that we have about racial reconciliation. Most white Americans, and especially white Christians, believe that the key to racial reconciliation is being nice, right? And that if you are nice, nothing else matters. As white Christians did under slavery, as they did under Jim Crow, and as we do today, both in the North and in the South, most white Christians feel no need to oppose contemporary racism. We've incorporated it just fine into our worldview and into our theology. But we do believe that we should be nice to individual people of color if and when we ever run into one. Widespread beliefs and assumptions. Now, strengthening racist systems and structures, another third kind of contemporary racism. People with influence have the opportunity to embed racism in the policies they develop, the procedures by which they operate, the laws they enact, the judicial rulings they give. This happens in all kinds of organizations and at all kinds of levels, of course. But here are some national examples from the last few years. There has been a significant increase in voter suppression since the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013. Why did they do that? Well, we know from what they wrote in their opinions. Chief Justice Roberts argued that the Voting Rights Act was no longer necessary because by 2013, racism had disappeared. Antonin Scalia said that the Voting Rights Act was not about protecting the right to vote for all citizens, but was instead, he said, quote, a racial entitlement. A racial entitlement, in case you didn't know, is when people of color have rights that are supposed to be reserved for white people. And we've got gerrymandering to reduce the voting influence of citizens of color, which has gone hand in hand with voter suppression. After all, if their votes don't matter, we don't have to bother to prevent them from voting. The attempt to add a citizenship question to the federal census for the explicit and very well documented purpose of reducing response rates from people of color. Treating immigrants and asylum seekers, including children, in absolutely inhumane ways. Partly, and I really believe this, partly for the sheer joy of it, and partly to gin up the base and make sure their hate level is where it needs to be come election day. Now, in addition to these three forms of contemporary racialization, there has also been a recent rise in anti-racism, right? This is consistent with Ibram Kendi's prediction. As the racist backlash against the civil rights movement has gotten stronger and more visible, and anti-racist backlash against the racist backlash has strengthened too. We can see this in a Pew Research Center report, Race in America 2019. White Americans are quite a bit less likely than Black Americans to say that discrimination has made it harder for Black people to get ahead, right? But look at that, 54% of white people do agree, a majority, a first, right? This is an all-time high. White people are also less likely to agree that Black people are discriminated against in specific arenas. But in arenas like criminal justice that have been in the news frequently, especially since about 2014, a majority of white people do now believe that discrimination is real. Unfortunately, there is quite a partisan difference, with white Democrats far more likely to believe that the nation has not gone far enough to address racism, and white Republicans far less likely to believe that the legacy of racism affects US society today. White Republicans are far more likely to say that too many people see discrimination where it doesn't exist. White Democrats are far more likely to say that too many people don't see discrimination where it does exist. And in a number of these and other similar opinion polls, many white Democrats' views mirror those of Americans of color. And that has never happened before. This is historically unprecedented. White support for Black Lives Matter is quite a bit higher than was white support for Dr. King in the 1960s. Millions of white Americans who were saying about a decade ago that racism is mostly behind us are now pretty tuned into the fact that racism is strong and getting stronger. The number of white people who believe that white supremacy is real and that it's a significant problem, and believe as well that something should be done about it, has risen noticeably, even just in the last 2 months. Whether this trend continues, we don't know. An even bigger question, whether these people can be convinced to attack the racialization that feeds the racism, we don't know that either. But with leadership and education, a group this size could make a difference. This is a moment, maybe more than a moment, and we need to take full advantage of it. So next week, we're going to talk about race in the church, and we're going to talk about specific things we can do to address both racialization and racism. So thank you for your time and attention. Let's talk. Your observations, your thoughts, your responses, your experiences, your questions. And you can either channel the conversation, or I will inflict my own questions on you. It's your call, whatever you want. So let's have at it.
I once knew, but what's the source of the term Jim Crow?
Oh, I've read that before, but I'm not sure in my answer. I believe it comes from a minstrel song. That's my memory right now. There was a minstrel song about a man named Jim Crow. Anybody else know, remember?
There was a minstrel song. It was like Jump Jim Crow. And
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, we'll all go home and Google that. That's the best we're going to do on that one. Sorry. I guess we're already home, aren't we? This notion of going home doesn't fit the current reality. I ain't not been home in a long time.
You know, we all have to act as individuals toward Black people. What can we do other than be nice to them as individuals? I mean, you're talking to individuals, not groups here.
Sure.
So what can we do?
Yeah. Well, I at the risk of repeating a couple of things I said last week, I think if you're just looking at the individual circumstance, right? Well, I'm going to back up just a little bit from that. For one thing, we can all do some things, kind of broaden our horizons so that when we do interact with people from different backgrounds, it's not such a rare event and it doesn't feel like an occasion to which we have to rise. is, right? Right, the Alliance for Cultural and Ethnic Harmony provides all kinds of opportunities for that. There are churches in town that do that, lots of other events and things like that. So I think the first thing on us, right, before we get to the particular question that you're asking about there, is, you know, find a way to break out of the bubble that we're in, so that when you do encounter people from different backgrounds, it's a pretty common thing, right? One of the things I tell my students is that you gotta, you know, you gotta break out of that bubble. My students talk about the Hope College bubble, right? Which is a very similar thing as the West Michigan bubble. And I said, the best thing you can do for yourself is to meet people on their turf and their terms, right? If you're white and you're in a white space and most of the people around are white, and you're interacting with somebody from Holland who is Latino or another ethnic minority, you're getting what they are like in a white place dominated by white people, right? Because most people of color are code switching. They're going back and forth as necessary. And so you're having an interaction, maybe a positive interaction, it may be beneficial in a variety of ways, but it's a very particular, very situated kind of interaction. Okay, so first thing, let's live lives so that having these interactions isn't so unusual. Second thing is, right, just whatever again, wherever you're meeting them, it's going to be in a particular context. There are things to talk about, just like you would if you and I ran into each other on, you know, the streets or something like that. So, you know, 90% of it is probably just whatever folks are talking about. It's hot out today, and we haven't left home, and right, all the things that we're talking about. In addition to that, and here finally now more specific to your point, and I think I made this comment to a question last week, just, you know, ask open-ended questions, right? If you're in an area and you're not quite sure now, is this going to be related to their culture or their racial identity in some way or not? Just stick with the open-ended questions. I know so many people of color who feel like they sometimes have interactions with white people that are designed to kind of go through a list of stereotypes right here, not necessarily consciously, but I'm just trying to go through, I'm going to ask you a series of questions that are sort of designed to help me figure out, do you fit my stereotype on this issue? Do you fit my stereotype on that issue? Do you fit my stereotype on the other issue, right? We've all heard about the question, where are you from? You know, where are you really from, right? Which I think indicates how ingrained it is in us to figure out how to respond to people based on their cultural identity. That's an example, right? So just ask some open-ended questions. Have you lived in Holland a long time, right? If you're in Holland, actually, right? Where do you work? Tell us about your family, some of that kind of stuff, and just see where that takes you. And somebody may volunteer. Yeah, you know what? I was born in Holland, but my folks were born in Cambodia, and you know, whatever. Or they may not feel like doing that. So I don't know. Just channel whatever voice in your head sounds like your mother. Right, in terms of how to treat people well. You know, go with that voice. Go with that voice. You can do that.
Chuck, I would also say that if you never talked to a person of color, you can educate yourself about U.S. history, about Black culture, Latino culture. You can go to movies, you can read books, you can do a whole lot of things so that you feel comfortable thinking about this culture instead of like, okay, I'm white and you're Black and what am I going to do?
Yeah.
You know, you don't start from ground zero, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, and make sure, Anne's exactly right. That's a corollary of getting out of your space is to educate yourself about that. That's another kind of stereotypical question, right? That white people start asking questions about Black history or Mexican American traditions or something like that. That we could get information about that from other sources. In addition to, go ahead, Anne.
No, I was just going to say, I know people of color who are, you know, they're polite, but they're really sick and tired of trying to educate white people.
Yep. And when you're reading about various cultures, make sure that you're reading descriptions from people within that culture, not people from outside that culture. There can be a role for, for that. If you're entering a culture, sometimes having somebody from your culture who can be a cultural broker, who can explain to you, okay, now, Americans tend to think this and the Germans tend to think that, right? But for the most part, if you want to know about German culture, at least begin by reading what Germans have to say about that, or any other group we've got there. I've
got a question.
Yes.
That I may be very naive on this, but it just, one of the things you mentioned, what is the issue or the problem with requiring proof of citizenship before one votes?
Yeah, well, like history, right? I'm not an expert on this, but I've done some reading about this, and I think there are a couple of issues there. One is that all of the research shows that voter fraud is a very, very, very rare thing, right? It doesn't happen very often, and so large changes in the voting system in order to prevent voter fraud are simply not necessary, right? I mean, I saw an account recently that there's something like 1,000 cases where people were not voting legally, and often, most of the time, they're just in a different precinct because they're confused about where they're supposed to go. And this happened over a 10-year period of time when there were literally billions of votes being cast. So it's a non-issue, right? And so if it's a non-issue, I think you have to ask, why do some people want us to think it's a big issue, right?
Yeah, it tends to be a very partisan issue right now.
It's a very partisan issue. And that's because people want you to think that it is a problem, because most of the solutions to the non-problem of voter fraud have the intended or unintended effect of hampering the vote of all kinds of marginalized people, right? Makes it harder to vote if you're poor. It makes it harder to vote if you are a person of color. It makes it harder to vote if you're older. All of these, so the net effect, even if it fixes 1,000 problems out of 1 billion, right? It has a much, much, much bigger effect on groups that are already marginalized in
How so?
society. Because of people who are less likely to have proof of citizenship, right? You don't have a car, you may not have a driver's license. I don't know, my mother would be hard pressed to prove who she is at the voting booth now at the age of 88, right? She hasn't driven in a number of years. She recently moved from her longtime residence. It'd be hard pressed for her to do that. The other thing is that if there are actually, people have recorded, have taken notes, right? And they've been leaked to the public. All the changes in voter laws in North Carolina, for example, a few years ago, there were actual minutes of meetings held in Republican Party, North Carolina Republican Party committees, in which they were open about deliberately trying to reduce the number of people of color in North Carolina who could vote. They had very, very specific voter ID recommendations, for example. And forgive me, I don't remember exactly what they were, but they decided, according to their minutes, they decided what those regulations would be on the basis of which forms of voter ID poor Black North Carolinians were least likely to have. So first they sent their interns out to find out that information. Then they got the report. Then they wrote the bill. Then they passed it into law.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's tragic.
Yeah, it is. It is. Right? So it's I mean, does anybody want voter fraud? No. I'd love to have, I'd like to have zero voter fraud. But I don't want to disenfranchise people who historically have disenfranchised in the process of doing that. And frankly, I just think we ought to be honest what we're really talking about here. As you know, the president has been very helpful in this regard, saying if we let people vote by mail, Republicans aren't going to win any more elections, right? I mean, that's just, they've just been very clear about their reason. While the stated reason has been voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud, but Donald Trump and several other people have said, well, Republicans won't win if too many people vote.
Thank you.
The other issue is long lines.
Long lines, yeah. Did you see the study just recently that people of color are likely to stand in much longer lines at voting where they go to vote, that the number of precincts in neighborhoods of color has been cut back in something like a dozen different states.
Terrible.
Increase the lines and make it harder to vote.
Chuck, one other thing people can do is follow legislation and contact their representatives, like following what's happening in the education department with money going out to private versus public schools.
Right.
Those types of things are very important today.
Yep, yep. And you know what? I completely agree, Dave. Thank you. Thank you for that. As an educator, I'm sure you're following that very well and are very, very informed on that. And it gets to be pretty overwhelming, but all of us have some issue like that that we care about. And if we could at least follow that one issue, right? Whether it's hunger or education, or criminal justice practices, whatever that might be.
Housing.
Housing, yes. Did I hear housing?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Karen. Absolutely. Right. And zoning laws, right? One of my questions was, are people who are against racism gonna be against racialization when it comes time to changing the zoning laws of their upscale townships where they live? Makes a huge effect on who can afford to live in a community.
One other thing that we could do, like work for Community Action House or work for Habitat for Humanity, some of those things too, locally, of how we can help various groups of people.
Yep. Yeah. One of the few things I've been doing outside the house during the pandemic is helping to deliver boxes of food for Community Action House. Either to people who physically can't get there, right? You can't get a big box of food on your bike. You can't logistically, right? Most people couldn't carry that home. You've got to have a car or a friend with a car. So some people can't make it, and some people are afraid to come in because they're not documented, right? And they've lost their job. So Community Action House has been delivering. While I was there a couple of weeks ago, someone who's employed by Community Action House said that the demand for food there is 400% what it was a year ago this time, right? It's way up. So food is another huge issue. And you can address that right through providing food, writing checks to Community Action House, working with Bread for the World on legislation that makes it easier, not more difficult for people to be well fed.
I was in a conversation with somebody the other day, an African-American man in town, and I found it very interesting. One of the thoughts that he was in kind of the initial stages of thinking through was how to compensate African-American families who were cheated out of the GI Bill or the effects of the GI Bill.
Right.
And I found, and just saying, if we could find these families and start a fund or whatever. And I thought that was a very interesting thing to pursue.
Yeah, that's a great.
Holland Zealand Community Foundation, I don't know.
And to start locally too, right?
That's exactly what he was saying. And I just found that really interesting, and look to the churches to support. And I look at the 3,000 people that were at the protest and say, are they willing to help? So keep your ears open or eyes open in case anything develops on that.
Yeah, interesting. There's a lot of talk about reparations. Usually people are referring to reparations for slavery. But I really like, I really like the reminder that there's so many things where reparations could be enacted. We don't have to go back to.
And I liked it because it's very, very tangible, or can be, and local. You
Yeah,
can,
I think anybody could see that that was unfair.
Yeah.
right, right. You could get banks behind it. You could get just a variety of.
Yep. I said last week, my dad would never have gone to college if it weren't for the GI Bill, and if he hadn't been white, he wouldn't have gone because the GI Bill wouldn't have been available to him. We have paid reparations, right? We paid reparations to Japanese Americans and their descendants who were incarcerated during the Second World War. They got a check for $20,000, right? So there is a precedent for that.
And I thought this was interesting because he said, you know, the GI Bill was available, but it wasn't a federal program, and I didn't understand any of that. And therefore, the local banks weren't lending to blacks,
Right.
so they couldn't take advantage of it.
Yeah. Same thing with the FHA, right? Which was a federal program, but it was channeled through the local banks. Same thing with the pandemic funds, right? The number of businesses of color who qualified but didn't get their application accepted was a much smaller percentage than for the comparable white businesses. And a lot of that had to do with the criteria that the race neutral, right? Like Nicole Hannah-Jones said in that video that I hope you could hear, right? That we use this race neutral language to enforce highly racialized policies. And, you know, it's the same way. So we don't even have to go back to the GI Bill. We could look at the loans and the forgiveness programs and the payroll programs last month that discriminated against businesses employed and owned by people of color. We could start there.
One other comment, if you're talking about reparations, and I know you'd be sensitive to this based on the way you started your program today, let's please not forget what we did to the Native Americans.
Yep. Yeah, thank you.
I have some books that I'd like you to comment on, if you would. So,
I'm not promising that I've read them.
well, if you know about them, and
Okay.
if you probably have read, I'm sure. So this is one
Yeah.
that you spoke about last
Yep.
week, which I read a couple years ago. This is another. I'm Still Black. No, I'm Still Here.
Still here.
Black
That's-
Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness.
Yeah, that's Austin Channing Brown's book.
Yes.
Yes, I have strategically read parts of that, but not the whole thing.
Okay. I'm part of my book club from Wisconsin, so some of these have been suggested.
Okay.
This is called Rising Out of Hatred, The Awakening of a Former White Nationalist by Eli Saslow.
Don't know that book.
And
Sounds interesting.
yeah, he's a Pulitzer Prize winner, I think, from the New York Times. And White Fragility,
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
And then another book we're going to read is
Oh, yeah.
Reconstructing the Bible, or the Gospel.
Yeah. Finding Freedom from Slaveholder Religion.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove. Yeah, right,
And
absolutely.
You mentioned him. Mhm.
Yep,
Last
yep.
week. Uh-huh.
He's working with William Barber, a pastor who founded Repairers of the Breach, I think, in North Carolina, which is an anti-racist, anti-poverty group that just recently, or in the middle of, they just recently had a big rally, another.
The Poor People's Campaign.
Thank you. Yes.
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 Last week or so.
Yeah. Yeah. So in what way would it be helpful for me to comment on one or more of those books?
Well, if you've read them, I'd like your opinion.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
In any way.
Yeah. So I think just a couple of I won't give full book reports on everything. I said last week that if you're going to read one book, it should be Between the World and Me. And I have not changed my mind in the last 7 days. I still believe that's a really powerful, that's a really powerful book, and just so well written. If you appreciate the written word, you'll love that book. It is both so historically and politically and economically contextual, right? But yet it's a letter to his adolescent son. And so deeply personal all at the same time, just as his son is coming of age and becoming, in the eyes of many in this society, a dangerous man. And so it's just a very moving book. I think White Fragility is more, it's focused on understanding what makes white people so anxious about race and talking about race. I think that's the subtitle, as I recall, why it's so hard to talk to white people about race or something like that. Which I think if you're white is a good thing. You don't have to read it and say, okay, she is telling me everything that is true about myself. But you can read it as kind of a checklist. Okay, well, have there been times that this has been true about me? Am I more worried about coming across as ignorant or racist, than I am about actually being ignorant or racist, right? Are we more worried about the appearance than about the reality? Do we shy away from people or groups or conversations because we're worried about being unmasked? I think you can have some empathy with that. It's actually it's a subpart. It's a subpart of a larger, I don't recall that D'Angelo uses this framing, but there's a social psychological construct called stereotype threat. And that's what happens when you are part of a group and you know people have a stereotype of that group, right? You know they do. You do not believe that it's true of you, but just interacting with them in that domain leaves you anxious and ironically more vulnerable to accidentally confirming that stereotype. Classic example in the research is that women who are good at math don't buy into the stereotype that they're not good at math because they're women. But if you give them standardized tests in which they have to check male or female at the top, they actually do worse on those math exams than if they don't have to check male or female at the top. And if you tell them, we picked this test for our group to take today because it's a test in which there is no gender difference on average in the scores, they do great because they can just focus on getting the answer right. Same thing with Black college students taking various sorts of exams, right? And if you do that on a computer, you can see that you can measure that they're actually going back to questions time and time and time again. They're changing this, they're changing that. They're just so anxious to demonstrate they're good, that they're smart kids, right? That they spend too much time worrying about that and they don't do as well as they could unless you can make those changes. I was on a path and then I went to another path and now I'm just sort of spinning around. But anyway, White Fragility and stereotype threat. White people are aware of the stereotype that we are racist, right? And we walk around with that. And even if we don't believe that it applies to us, when we're interacting in interracial groups, we may be anxious that we are inadvertently going to come across as ignorant or white or a typical white racist or something like that. And that can increase our anxiety level in such a way that it actually interferes with our ability to have those productive conversations that we were talking about right at the beginning of the Q&A. So I think that's,
Chuck.
Yes.
Chuck, Rick Byrne, I've got a question.
Hey, Rick.
It may be a little bit of a sensitive question, but I'm going to ask it, and if you tell me it's out of line. If we think of where the post office...
I'm very good at blaming other people. So
okay. We all know where the post office is located in Holland on 8th Street.
Yep.
We also all know where the Civic Center is located in Holland on 8th Street.
Yes.
In that geographical strip down there, I don't think, this is just my feelings, there are many Asian, Hispanic, or Black employees walking down the strip, leaving the post office property, entering the Civic Center property. Can you comment on that, or is it inappropriate?
I'm happy to comment on it, and I will begin with a couple of caveats, not because I'm trying to cover my backside, but because I want to be clear about what I know and what I don't know. I have never had a conversation with the Downtown Merchants Association about this, right? I've never had a conversation with an employer about that downtown.
I'll look at your email. Well, honey, I just walked by and I said she just sent us an email. Okay, I'm gonna look it up to help you out.
Okay.
Why isn't that on here?
So I've never had a conversation. I've never been part of this discussion with anybody who hires people downtown, right? But just based on the fact that I've lived in Holland a long time, I have been downtown, I have made the same observation you have. It seems pretty clear that there is a certain clientele that downtown is aimed for. It's been pretty clear some of the businesses that have not been allowed to open up downtown, or based on what I've read in the paper, or have been sort of run out of downtown, that they don't fit a very clear target demographic for downtown. I was at the Frost Social Science Research at the college in the 1990s, and we did one of the early just surveys, right? We went, by we I mean work study students. I paid minimum wage to go out on a Saturday downtown, and on a couple of evenings, right? We picked some random days in October when there was still some good traffic downtown, but it wasn't just, right, all the Illinois people. And we found that, and I don't know if this is still true, but it looks true to me, that the average person who was shopping downtown was a well-to-do white woman between the ages of 45 and 70, right? That has very clearly been the demographic. And frankly, I think there are people who think that we would drive some of those folks away if they had to deal with a racially diverse set of folks downtown. Back in the 90s, 25% of the people who shopped downtown on the days we were there drove more than 30 miles to get to Holland, right? It was an all-day destination for them because they liked the shopping and they liked the lunch. And many of those out-of-towners averaged once a month to get here, right? So there's a very particular demographic that is pouring tons of money into downtown. And so I think it's more than that, right? I think it's the affordable housing that somebody wanted to put up on River Avenue, close to 9th Street. And it wasn't very long, and that land was bought up and repurposed for something else, right? And there were quotes in the paper about it just wasn't going to be a good fit for downtown, right? I can tell you, when you hear not going to be a good fit, that's pretty thin dog whistle politics there, right? One of the things I've learned in the organizations I've been a part of is that if you're white, you're not a good team player if you're not going along with stuff. But if you're a person of color, you are not a good fit. And so when I hear people say, I just don't think that would be a good fit, it's hard for me not to hear that in racialized terms. Any other thoughts about that? Any pushback?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. We've talked about in Hess that we're not diversified at all. We have very few minority members. And the remark that I hear is that we try, but they don't feel comfortable in our organization. Now, I think that would be people that I know, would say, hey, yeah, we want more people. But I don't know what the problem is. They say, well, there aren't enough professionals. That professional thing in the title of our organization. which in itself is kind of a restrictive thing.
It's a very restricted thing.
It doesn't make any difference to me if you're a professional or not. If you're interested in learning, I'd love to have you in our group. So I think, you know, just like everybody else, we have to look at ourselves and say, what can we do about this sort of thing?
Yeah.
It always, when we moved here, it struck me very funny that I knew that there was a large Latino population in Holland, and I never saw any Latinos in downtown Holland. Why? You know, I know why.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think, you know, I again, I don't know HASP that well. I don't know the history of HASP. Certainly don't know the rationale of that, but the word professionals has always struck me as being intentionally exclusive. And I'm a, you know, white middle-class professional. Now, whether it was intentionally exclusive or unintentionally exclusive, I think it is, right? I think people look at that and they know whether that's an organization that would be geared for them or not. The other thing that happens is that once that organization develops and has a set of norms and a clientele and a way of doing things, it becomes more than just the word that might keep somebody out. It becomes the way that things are done, right? All the implicit reasons, all the implicit cultural reasons for doing things in a particular way get embedded into that organization. The other thing is, and this is not about HASP, okay, here's my line, talked about HASP, not talking about HASP, although it might be, you know, it might be pertinent. A lot of the research on white Christian congregations, right? Person after person after person in those congregations will say, we're the nicest, okay, this is a bit of a condensation. We're the nicest people in town. We would love to have people of more diverse backgrounds come to church, and they would be so warmly welcomed if they were. And we just don't understand why they're not here, right? But everything about what they do in their history and their informal social networks, right? How do people end up at a church? They either live close to it or they know somebody who's recommended it for them. I suspect that knowing somebody who's recommended it to them is an important way that people get involved with HASP, right? And if we're living in this West Michigan bubble that we've created, and the social networks of most of the people in the organization are pretty homogeneous, there aren't going to be a lot of, right, a lot of folks. So that if I am a professional of color and I'm qualified to join, I may walk in and not have the advantage that somebody that I would have if I had been your guest that day, right? And if I'd walked in and I would say, oh, well, I know so-and-so and I know so-and-so, right? A lot of the white folks who walk into HASP, unless they're brand new to town, are probably having that experience. So it is tough. And once that organization gets up and going in a particular way, it's going to require some real changes, right? Again, to go back to the church, most multicultural, multiracial churches do not last as multicultural and multiracial for very long. They make the effort, and one of a couple of things happen. Either it's a predominantly white church and their efforts to become more diverse don't work very well. And so the small number of people of color there end up leaving to go someplace else. Either that happens or the church begins to make some changes that the white majority doesn't like, and the white people start leaving the church, right? It turns out that most of the people who are in a multiracial church and leave are white, because most white people are used to being in organizations where everything is run in a way that makes sense to them and that fits them and fits their style. And most people of color are accustomed to being in organizations where they're having to do things somebody else's way a pretty high percentage of the time. So the folks who leave multiracial churches tend to be the white people, because we want to have our way. And the things that people have disagreements about in multiracial churches aren't necessarily the things that people think about. They tend to be about time, right? The implicit, unspoken things. If we say we're going to start at 10, dang it, we need to start at 10. And if we're supposed to get out at 11, dang it, we better be getting out at 11. And if folks are coming in at 10:15 and service goes till 11:20, and I miss my brunch date downtown, right? This is the stuff people are having real arguments about. So I think once that culture develops, it's tough. You know, we've got 7 minutes and I forgot to plug my computer in. So I would just like to say now that if I leave, I am not going off in a huff. I'm just, you know, I'm just about 7 minutes away from being out of power. So one more thing we can talk about before I literally crash and burn.
We could call it Hope Association of Simple People. Or something.
Yeah.
I was going to say that on 8th Street, my favorite restaurant is Mizu Sushi, which is entirely Asian clientele, and it's got delicious food, and I frequent it very frequently.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. In some ways, the exception that proves the rule, right? Because it's still a mostly middle-class clientele that would be there. And frankly, I mean, I know you love it for the food. I like it for the food. But there are people who would be more comfortable in a restaurant that was 40% East Asian than they would be in a restaurant that was 40% Black. Or, you know, there are lots of white people who would fall into that category.
You know, churches, it sounds like a small thing, but if you're a person of color, you walk into a church, there's no art that looks anything like you. There are no variety of languages. There's nothing except white things.
Yep, that's the message. Yep. Paul Keivel wrote a really interesting essay a number of years back, being a guest on a college campus, and he just looked at the walls of all the places that he was, starting with the hotel room on campus where he stayed, and then going through the classroom buildings and that kind of stuff. It's just a description of the stuff he saw on the walls, right?
You know, there's a big.
I'm sorry.
There's a big population of churches in our town. But compared to other places I've lived, we've got a very small Black population.
Oh, yeah.
Isn't that one of the reasons that you don't see Blacks going into white churches? There just aren't that many of them. And is there a Black church here in town? I don't know of it. Maybe there is.
Yes, there is.
Okay.
Yeah, and there are a couple of pretty multiracial churches as well. I think your point about that is well taken. I would say that even though, what is the percentage of Blacks in Holland? 3 or 4%. Most churches don't have 3 or 4% even. But we do have a third of the city of Holland is Latinx folks, and you know, so there's a large population to draw from there. You know what? I am getting noises and flashing X's on my screen. So rather than just completely embarrass myself, I promise to plug in next time, Ken. Rather than just embarrass myself and go, I'm going to say, thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for your great questions. I really enjoyed talking with you. Next week, we're going to talk about the church. So thank you for that segue question. And we're going to talk about what can we do next. Okay, I release you into the wild. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks.